Let's talk about the word percent. What do you hear when you hear percent? You hear the word cent. What does the word cent mean? If you think about a cent, that is 1 penny out of 100 to make a whole. Percent means out of 100. And percent, if there's 100 to equal $1, well, 1 whole equals 100%. So we're going to look at these models and talk about a fraction, a decimal, and a percent. So this first one is shown for you, and there's 84 out of 100 shaded. So that's 84 hundredths. As a decimal, that's 84 hundredths. As a percent, that's 84%, because out of 100, 84 are shaded. Yes, we can simplify that fraction by dividing by 4, and we could get 21/25. But right now I want to focus out of 100. So let's look at this next one. How much is shaded? There are 66 out of 100 shaded. So that's 66 out of 100, which is read as 66 hundredths. Since percent means out of 100, that means there's 66% of that whole shaded. What about the next one? How many are shaded? There's 43 shaded out of 100. So 43 out of 100, which is 43 hundredths. So what that means is 43% of that whole is shaded. The next one, how much is shaded? 28 out of 100. So that means 28 hundredths is shaded. So 28% is shaded. What I want you to realize from this is that 84 hundredths, and 84% are all the same amount. So that means they're equivalent. 66 hundredths, and 66% all represent the same amount. So again, those are equivalent numbers. I can write that shaded amount as 66 hundredths as a fraction, 66 hundredths as a decimal, or 66%. Again, it's all talking about the same amount. So what we're going to talk about next is going from a fraction to a decimal to a percent and back and forth. First, we're going to talk about how to go from a fraction to a decimal. So I'm going to use FDP a lot as a reference. So I'm talking about going from a fraction to a decimal to a percent, or percent to decimal to fraction. So let's first talk about how to go from a fraction to a decimal. We've actually just talked about that on Friday. To go from a fraction to a decimal, we're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. So divide the numerator by the denominator. I like to say top dog goes in the house, meaning the number on top goes inside the house. So for example, if I have 5/8, that would be 5/8 would be 5 divided by 8. And I would put a decimal 0, because we obviously know that this is less than 1 whole. So I know my answer is going to be less than 1 whole. So I put my 0. 8 goes into 56 times, which is 48. I subtract 50 minus 48 is 2. I'm going to add another 0. 8 goes into 22 times, which is 16. I subtract and I get 4. I add another 0. I'm kind of running out of room. 8 goes into 45 times, which is 40. So 5/8 equals 625 thousandths. Now, how do I go from fraction to decimal? I just did that. I divided. How do I go from decimal to percent? Well, all I do is multiply by 100. Because percent means out of 100. And you're like, oh, that's great. I multiply by 100. I have to like sit there and write times 100 every time. So let's talk about what you really do. To turn a decimal to a percent, to do that, I just move the decimal 2 places to the right. And I'm going to go the same direction as I am going from D to P in FDP, fraction to decimal to percent. Okay, so I'm going to take this decimal that I see over here in 625 thousandths, and I'm going to move that 2 places. And yes, I can have a decimal in a percentage. So that means 5/8 is 625 thousandths, which would be 62 5/10%. So when I say multiply by 100, that's the same thing as taking that decimal and moving it 2 places to the right. So if going from decimal to percent is multiplying by 100, what do you think going from percent to decimal is? I'm going from here to here, multiply by 100. Now I'm going from this way. What do you think? I'm going to divide by 100. So, in other words, move the decimal 2 places to the left. So, to the left, I'm going from FDP. Well, now I'm going from P to D. And which direction is that? P to D is going left. So, I'm going to move the decimal place 2 places to the left. So, I'm going to give you a different example. Let's say this time I have let's say that I have 35%. Okay, if I have 35%, there's an invisible decimal at the end of 35. Just like a period is at the end of the sentence, there's a decimal at the end of the number. We just don't see it. So I would take that and I would move that 2 places to the left. So that would make that 35 hundredths. So now I've gone from a percent to a decimal. Okay, all I did was take that decimal point, move it 2 places to the left, just like going from FDP. I'm going from P to D, percent to decimal. I'm going to the left. Now I want to go from decimal to fraction. Well, we've actually already learned that. I'm just going to use place value. And what I'm going to do is the place value of the decimal is the denominator of the fraction. In other words, I'm just going to read this decimal correctly and write it and simplify it. So you really just read it, write it, and simplify it. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at the example that we had. We had this .35, period 35. So that is read as what? That's read as 35 hundredths. So if I read that correctly, it's 35 hundredths. So 35 over 100. And then I'm like, can I simplify that? Yes, I can divide by 5 on both sides, and 35 divided by 5 is 7, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So that would be 7/20ths. So 35% is equal to 35 hundredths, which is 35 hundredths, which is 7/20ths. So that is an example of how you go to fraction to decimal to percent, percent to decimal to fraction.